Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Claire. I'm the event coordinator for Village Books in Bellingham, Washington and Linden, Washington, and I am so delighted to be here hosting this special event tonight. Some things I want to say real quick about Crowdcast. If you've never watched an event on Crowdcast before, if you're hearing an echo, you might try putting in some headphones. You could try turning down the volume on your computer, or just make sure that you only have one tab open, one window open. If you have more than one open, you're going to get a little bit of a feedback. So that should take care of your echo situation. I'm loving seeing all the chats on the right side of the screen here. Thank you to everybody who's chiming in and excited. We are just as excited here. Let's see. There's a green button in the upper right hand corner of the screen. It says follow. If you click on follow, you will get updates and emails letting you know what is happening on the Village Books Crowdcast channel. I encourage you to follow us. We have lots of events coming down the road, so I encourage you to do that. Also, speaking of upcoming events, tomorrow at 5 o'clock, we're going to be welcoming Peter Lawfer to the Readings Gallery, the virtual Readings Gallery. He's going to present his latest book, Up Against the Wall, The Case for Opening the Mexican-American Border. He's going to be in conversation with Peter B. Collins. It's going to be a fascinating discussion on a very timely topic, so I encourage you to tune into that tomorrow at 5 p.m. And to those of you who made a contribution at registration for this event, I appreciate it. While all of our events so far are free events in our virtual Lit Live series, we do appreciate those of you who kicked in some dollars at registration to support us in our programming. We do appreciate it in this strange time in which we're living. I'm basically learning as I go along and just trying to keep that robust event programming that Village Books is known for. So thank you so much for that contribution. We do appreciate it. And if you didn't, that's fine too. We love being able to offer free events here at Village Books. So let's see. I mentioned the chat earlier. I want to let you know that I'm going to disable the chat. I also want to let you know that I'm going to bring it back later for the Q&A. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that right now before I forget about it. You will have a chance to say a little something later at the Q&A in the chat, but for right now we're just going to disable that. If you think of a question throughout the course of the event, through the conversation tonight, you are welcome to pop it into Ask a Question. If you look at the bottom of the screen there, you will see it says Ask a Question. Click on that and a little dialog box pops up. You type in your question and close it back up, and we just gather the questions there so that we have them in time for the Q&A. So you can do that at any time during the event this evening. And another important feature of Crowdcast, an important button, is this one right there. It says Purchase Analogia here. That is a link directly to the Village Books website that takes you to the page that has both authors' books for sale. We do encourage you, if you're feeling so inspired tonight, to click through to that link and purchase the books. The authors have kindly agreed to provide signed copies. So if you purchase from Village Books, you will get a signed copy of the books. So again, that's right, that green button center screen. If you are watching the recorded version of this on YouTube, you can see the link below to that very same website. Okay, I think that's all about the business, the nuts and bolts. So now is the fun part, a little bit about our moderator this evening. Clyde Ford is a longtime friend of Village Books and a longtime resident of the Pacific Northwest, but he was actually born in New York City. He's the author of 13 works of fiction and nonfiction, including most recently, this one right here, Think Black, a memoir. He's also a psychotherapist, an accomplished mythologist, a sought-after public speaker. In 2006, he received the Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Award in African American Fiction. We're delighted to have him here tonight. And now for our featured author. George Dyson is a dual citizen of the United States and Canada. He's an independent historian of technology whose subjects have included the development and redevelopment of the Iloot kayak, the evolution of artificial intelligence, A Path Not Taken into Space, and the transition from numbers that mean things to numbers that do things in the aftermath of World War II. Wow, it's a broad range that he has covered. Dyson lives in Bellingham, and he's here tonight to present his brand new book, this one right here, Analogia, The Emergence of Technology Beyond Programmable Control. So, from your homes or wherever you may be, please join me in giving a warm welcome to George Dyson and Clyde Ford.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you very much, Claire. And George, this is such a thrilling time for me to be here with you. Our friendship goes back to me first coming to Bellingham one evening when I walked into your shop with the kayak club. And I think from there on, over the years, we've had the opportunity to meet over breakfast, over email, way back when, even over telephone, if you remember back then. And we shared our love both of technology, our love of the Pacific Northwest, and of boating as well, too. I love Analogia. And when I was reading the book, George, here's the thought that I had. I remembered being 10, 11, and one of the things I loved to do back then was to build electronic circuits. I would take a recipe from Popular Electronics, go to a Radio Shack store, and I'd buy all these components. And there were transistors and resistors and diodes and capacitors, and each component did something different. Now, I wasn't always sure exactly what they did, but I knew that if you put them together in the right way, you could pull music out of the air as though it was magic. You could send your voice through the air as though it was magic. And when I was reading your book, I began to feel that each chapter was like one of those electronic components. Very different, but yet, when you put them together, I mean, you have a chapter on the 18th century Russian exploration and colonization of Alaska, the 19th century United States government suppression of Native Americans. You have a chapter on your father's work in building the atomic bomb, your work in building Badarka kayaks, living in a treehouse in British Columbia, your relationship with some of the really important women in your life, all very, very different. And yet, in the book, they hang together as though like magic, pulling this beautiful music out of the air. So my first question to you is, George, how did you do it? And what is it that allows these disparate single chapters to pull together into this beautiful whole?
Yeah, well, that's a beautiful way to put it. So thank you. I mean, and here's where we speak the same language, because we're about the same age, and we grew up on the East Coast, and we grew up in that world of analog electronics. I mean, the high point of my childhood, or one of the high points, was when a couple of years, my mother, who was separated from my dad, she lived in New York City, and so I could go in and see my mom on the weekends, and she would take me. What I wanted to do was go to Canal Street, to those war surplus electronic stores. She'd come with me and bring a few dollars, and I'd buy all this stuff, the same as you. It was so fascinating to have these individual vacuum tubes and put them together in a way that something would happen. So the book, that's sort of a very good analogy for how the book is put together. What's interesting is that the book started, it had a beginning and an ending. That's what I saw. And those both disappeared. I mean, my original, for a long time, I've been having this nagging vision in my mind of this book that, again, I'm obsessed with the Aleutian Islands, with this 1,500 mile, 1,500 mile stretch of islands that are just far enough apart, or close enough together that it's possible, if you're really lucky, to kayak from one island to the next, but far enough apart that only phenomenal kayakers could do it. So if you were an intelligent designer trying to design the perfect kayak, you would design the Aleutian Islands, and then would evolve. But in my vision, I wanted to write a book. I never wrote fiction. That the opening was fiction set in the Aleutians before the Russians arrived. So I wanted to give a picture of what life was like before there was written language, before there were any white people. I lived so deeply in my imagination, in that culture. And then I saw that clearly. And then I saw the end of the book where I was going to write another fictional chapter set in future Aleutians islands where the entire world has Google and Amazon and Apple and Facebook have taken over as what's happening today. So everything is surveillance and digital, everything is controlled, but the powers that be have decided we need sort of a biodiversity reserve for human beings, and they set aside the Aleutian Islands. So you can live in the Aleutian Islands, but you can have no digital technology, sort of like Erewhon, like the Samuel Butler novel. Mm-hmm. And then I gave up. I mean, I can't write fiction. I just, it terrified me. I just, like whatever I do, it's just people can say, well, things were going okay for George until he tried to write fiction. Why didn't he stick to, he was doing pretty good at history. He should have just, because it's disastrous when people sometimes switch fields. So anyway, I gave up on that opening chapter and the ending chapter, but the middle of the book is all still there. These 9 chapters that, as you said, sort of go through this very different ways of looking at the same situation with this thread of sort of how did we take North America from the North Americans, which is sort of all my books have been driven by trying to tell somebody's story that needs to be told. And then in this book, there's also this autobiographical. I wrote so many books about other people. I finally said, well, like your memoir that just came out. I'm going to tell my own story.
Mm-hmm. So, but there's something more than even just your story and the story of how this country took Native American land from them. What knits that together? I mean, what knits your story, George, together with the story of Native Americans, together with the building of the atomic bomb, together with the tree house in British Columbia? What's the glue? What's the continuous thread? What's the flow that knits those disparate stories together?
Yeah, they're different stories. They just, I think it's like writing a novel. How do you know why did this happen and not that happen? Except right. It's all the scenes are drawn from history, not, they're not made up, but they're put together in a very arbitrary way. And then in the end, I'm trying to make this important technical point, which again, there's many levels, but one level, I'm trying to say a very, I think, hugely important technical thing about the evolution of the digital universe, how it inevitably will go back to analog, and that is framed in this mathematical, one of the big unresolved mathematical questions. Maybe tomorrow we'll hear in the newspaper someone has resolved the continuum hypothesis, but it was announced as the most important problem in mathematics, number 1 in 1920, and it's still unresolved. And it's this question of whether you can have a medium-sized infinity. We, as far as we know, infinities, there's extra small infinities and there's extra large. It's like T-shirts at the end of a conference. There's no middle-sized infinities, and there's a hugely profound, seemingly impractical mathematical question, just like the questions that Alan Turing, our sort of patron saint of mm-hmm. computing, were asking, seemed to have no connection to the real world, but actually changed the real world more than anything else. And I think the same thing, I think there's something going on in this middle-sized infinity that's going to do the same thing. And that we are actually constructing a middle-sized infinity. Which is the infinities, the small infinities are countable. So that's like grains of sand on a beach that never ends, but you could count the grains of sand. And then the large infinities are uncountable. It's like a flow of water. It's a flow of time. There's no increments. And in this digital universe, we are technically creating a countable infinity, but it's growing so fast that it's effectively, so I think we have created this middle-sized infinity. And what I think you can say is that sort of the analog is going to come back in that, in a very deep way that changes everything. And I think you can see the first signs of that, which I hint at in these large companies that are starting to control everything. Because in nature, the countable infinities, the discrete infinities, are used in genetics for error correction and so on. But nature, all the control systems in nature are analog. They're done with the continuous functions, with the large infinities. And I think nature's going to come back and take over this medium-sized infinity, and that's what the book is all about. But I had to tell all those strange stories to get there. Yeah.
I love it. Hey, before we go on too much further, I bet there's some folks who are listening to us who couldn't really tell or give a great definition for digital versus analog. So I think I'm going to ask you to help us have this discussion by starting with a good definition of the difference between digital and analog.
Yes, and there are different ways you can define the difference, and there's a gray zone in between. The technical difference is that analog computing, you are computing with continuous functions, with functions that just change gradually, like fluid going through pipes or something like that, like the nervous system of any creature we know. And digital computing, you compute in these precise logical increments where every bit, which we now take for granted, that every bit makes a difference. And it's two very different ways of computing. And again, the world that we grew up in, the IBM of your father, was just beginning to make the switch from, it was punched cards. It took us sort of out of that continuous function into these discrete functions where the cards had, the whole was either, which becomes an issue in the election, it's either yes or no, it's one or zero. And it's not related to material. So you can build an analog computer out of silicon, or you can build a digital computer out of plywood and 2x4s. I mean, it's independent of the material. It's the way you compute. And the other definition is to look at nature. So digital computing is genetics, where each nucleotide has a specific meaning that changes completely if you change that nucleotide. And analog computing is the brain, where there's no exact, the complexity is not in the logical code, it's in the connections in the architecture itself.
So there's almost this sense then, when I hear you talking, of at the heart, at the base of who we are even as human beings, is a digital code, but in how we function as human beings is an analog code. Yes. That is our brains and nervous systems, our sensory systems, our connection with other people, how we see, how we perceive the world. That's analog. And yet at the heart of all that is our DNA, which has nucleotide sequences, which are more appropriately digital. That's a really interesting balance to try to put together in one human being. And it's one of the things that comes through so clearly in your book as you write about it.
Yeah, and the point is that we need both. It's not going to be when you tell people in one sentence, they say, George says, digital is going away and analog is taking over. No, we're going to always have digital and microprocessors and all this stuff. What we're doing is building an analog layer. An analog layer is sort of evolving on top of it, the same way the digital layer evolved on top of analog hardware. And we need both approaches. And of course, my last two books, Darwin Among Machines, which was written in this beer cooler down at Dick's Tavern without the internet, at a time when I still had to walk up to Western to get an internet connection. So it was like the last book written about the internet without using the internet.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like I paid my dues. I mean, I wrote 2 deep books about the evolution of the digital side. So now I sort of felt, it's time to play for the other side and argue for the analog, because we got to have both. I mean, we're making a huge mistake to not recognize. The people who believe in this sort of digital utopia that everything is going to be a completely controlled formal system, I think are provably wrong. And if you look at the real world, it's of course the value in these hugely successful companies, the Amazons, the Apple, the Google, and so on. It's that they're a lot of what they're doing is analog computing. They're computing statistically with continuous functions, no longer strictly digital, and that's how they're gaining control. And we need to be aware of that and recognize it. And that's why the other huge distinction is that in analog computing there is no algorithm. So people now have sort of worshipped the algorithm. They think everything is controlled by somebody's controlling the algorithm that is doing things. But you can have, in nature, you have very effective control systems that have no algorithms. They're not there.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to that point in a moment, but before we do, I want to ask you a couple of things more about the book that I found really fascinating, and it really feeds into this discussion we're having about analog and digital. So if we had not had a pandemic, my guess is that you and I hope it would have been you and I, would have had this conversation, but we would have had it maybe at the Spark Museum in Bellingham, which is the big museum that's still, it's a radio museum. It's a museum of the 1910s and 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, because one of the most prominent things throughout just about every piece of equipment in that museum is a vacuum tube.
Right.
And one of the things that was so prominent in the early parts of your book were vacuum tubes. So I want you to say a little bit, for many people in the audience who I'm sure don't even know what the heck a vacuum tube is, why that was important in this whole metamorphosis that we're talking about between an analog and digital world, and where that came into being, and why, in some respects, I almost saw you using the vacuum tube as a metaphor or an analogy to talk about some of the other important things you talk about in Analogia.
Yes, and of course the people who invented the vacuum tube were interesting people, so that helps. But we were, in fact, the Spark Museum was booked. This event was going to be in some of Village Books events are at the Bellingham High School, and some are at, this one was clearly going to be at the Spark Museum. We would have been
interesting. So I wasn't so far off. Good.
No, and I went, and it's one of the 7 wonders of Bellingham. I mean, hardware sales, the radio, the Spark Museum, they're right up there. When I went to RCA, that still had, at that time in archives, they were throwing everything out to rent the archive building to a drug company. But a group of Eagle Scouts were there with their scout leader trying to scan stuff before it was being thrown out. But when I, showed up, I said, "Oh, you're from Bellingham. That's where the radio museum is." That was all they knew about Bellingham, was that we had this fantastic museum of early electronics. So yeah, I mean, part of my love for vacuum tubes is simply growing up with them. They were in a way, they were forbidden. I mean, a television set, which again, if you were a child of the 1950s, the television was like the fireplace in the home, and we didn't have one. But when you looked inside, there were all these tubes glowing, and the first thing a grown-up would tell you is, "Don't touch the tubes." So it's kind of like, we also, as kids, we caught snakes because we were told, be careful around snakes. Of course, we had to go out and catch snakes and snapping turtles, and the vacuum tubes were the same way. They were dangerous, but you wanted to understand them. And they're the perfect analogy for what is happening now, because vacuum tubes treat streams of electrons as continuous functions. Vacuum tubes started off doing analog computing, amplifying, and so on. You could build very effective computers out of vacuum tubes, and that's what's happening on the internet today. We're effectively rebuilding these old analog circuits where the sort of continuous statistical flow of bits is amplified somewhere else. I mean, somebody has a YouTube channel and it's getting a lot of clicks. That amplifies, that's connected to an advertiser and is amplified. And we're building exactly those same kinds of circuits. So that's why I think it's, although the vacuum tube itself is more or less extinct, except for obsessive, audio recording and so on, you still get better behavior out of vacuum tubes than solid state. But it's a lost art of building them. But the idea behind them is still, I think, sort of, that's again how the book ends. Sort of the ghost of the vacuum tube is coming back.
Right. Great analogy. And the other thing that comes through, that really came through strongly for me in reading Analogia, was this sense of what Wallace Stegner, the Midwest, the Western author, used to talk about as a sense of place. Both of us grew up on the East Coast, but we both moved here to Bellingham on the West Coast. Just about every place you named in the book I've been to, often on a boat. But my question was, even though this book talks about things on the East Coast, talks about things in Alaska, talks about things in the Southwest, this is really a Pacific Northwest book. This is a Bellingham book. This is a British Columbia book. Why? Why was it that this part of the world attracted you so strongly? I know it attracted me so strongly. What was it that's so compelling about this part of the world? And how did it figure into Analogia in the way that it has?
Yes, well, of course, as we all know, you have the mountains and the ocean, and I owe it to just chance and people in my life. My older sister, who moved to Vancouver to get married when I was just turned 17, invited me to her wedding, so I ended up in Vancouver. And then my mother, who also moved to Canada, and David Brower, who actually published a big book called A Sense of Place. He was the guy who turned the Sierra Club into a modern environmental organization and sort of took me under his wing when I was basically a homeless teenager. And he had gone up to, he was also a hugely influential mountaineer. So he had flown into Knight's Inlet in 1935 to make one of the first attempts to climb Mount Waddington, unsuccessful, but he knew, he had seen the British Columbia coast, and when I got the chance to go to Vancouver, he just said, "Oh, you're going to love it," and of course wanted me to. That's how I became a writer, really, because he wanted me to write a book about the British Columbia coast. So in a way, there's a direct lineage from that to this book. The real hook to the Northwest Coast was what we remember as the Bering-Chirikov expedition, the Russian expedition to Alaska in 1741, when it wasn't known whether Asia and America were connected or not. That's how, when Bering Strait was sort of put on the map. And the just impossibly strange fact is, when I researched more deeply the origins of the Bering expedition, that idea was originated by Leibniz, who was the sort of Turing's grandfather in the genealogy of digital computing. So Leibniz ended up he made friends with Peter the Great, who, it was a time when most of the politicians, the royalty, were sort of like Trump. They had no interest in science. Leibniz was a great scientist, and he wanted to do science, but he kept sort of, kissing up to the royalty in Europe, but all he wanted him to do was he wanted him to develop a mathematical proof that their lineage, should rule forever, that kind of thing. Whereas Peter the Great was actually really interested in science. So they spent 8 days. They agreed to stop drinking alcohol for 8 days, and among the two things they talked about were this plan to send an expedition to America and to build digital computers and take over the world. So somehow those two things that had preoccupied my life, digital computing and the Northwest Coast, both trace back to Leibniz.
So we're shortchanging the audience here in not saying a little bit more about Leibniz, what he discovered, and where his discovery came from, because it's a more fascinating story than you've even told us so far, George. So say a little bit more about Leibniz's contribution to binary mathematics and what divination system that came from.
Yeah, he sort of brought it into the modern scientific repertoire, but he was, and I admire him for this, because so often I'm dealing with people who don't credit their sources. But Leibniz was very clear that he credited binary arithmetic to the Chinese, and their system that has descended to us as the I Ching. They had a very clear system of binary arithmetic, and he was clear that the Chinese recognized that this also was equivalent to logic, that there was an equivalency between binary arithmetic and logic. So Leibniz, and he's, in a strange way, he wanted to bring digital computing sort of back to China in modern form. He thought Peter the Great could help him. So they were just centuries ahead of their time in what they wanted to do.
And I really found, particularly, you talk about this in the opening to Analogia, and I just love that, because what it connects, as you've said so clearly, is the mathematics of the modern digital age with the beauty of the land that we live in. And in a sense, it connects the digital revolution of the modern age with the analog world that was inhabited by Northwest Coast natives long before the Russians first got here. So I also really love the poetry of seeing this continual reference that you made between the analog world and the digital world in ways that I think most people wouldn't even think about. I mean, holding a cell phone and recognizing that the history of the technology there is somehow related to the world that we walk around and paddle in, and you were up in a treehouse in. I mean, it's just really fascinating. And that's, again, what I loved about Analogia, is that it exploded and explored all of these incredible connections. So one of the things you also, that I found really fascinating, you talk in the book about growing up as a child of arguably one of the most famous physicists of the 20th century. And I remember in conversation we talked about, and I think you referenced this in your book, where as a really young child, you're at an event with your family. I believe it's at Princeton, maybe it's at the Institute for Advanced Studies, and you're placed in a crib, presumably because maybe you're, I don't know, a little bit unwieldy, or just your parents don't want to deal with you at the time, and you're put aside basically in a room, and someone walks in to give you a drink. Who was it that walked in? Why are they so important? And what must that have been like as a child growing up in the middle of these incredible minds?
Yeah, of course. First of all, when I was little, my father wasn't famous yet. He was just in fact, he didn't have a PhD and my mom did. So in a way, she was ahead of him. But that is one of my earliest memories. I mean, I sort of have three or four you always have these early memories, and you can't put them in order, but you can kind of try and figure them out. Like, I mean, I remember going to Europe on a ship, and that can be dated because, I can look at an old passport or something. But this memory is back in that dawn of primal memory. I remember being taken to this party, obviously, because they couldn't get a babysitter, I guess. I remember, so I was hauled in the car to this party, and they must have called the host and said, well, yeah, you can bring the kid along. We'll put him in the back room. So they put me in this back room in this crib, but everybody was having a party. I mean, talking loudly and drinking, and there were a lot of parties. I mean, people think these scientists worked hard, but they had a lot of parties.
They partied hard too.
Yeah, they did. So anyway, I was very unhappy being in this crib in the back room when the party was somewhere else. And then this gentleman came in, who I remember as being kind of, plump and super friendly, and came in to talk to me like, why are you so unhappy? Of course, I couldn't understand words then. And then he gave me a sip of his drink. He had this drink and he put it through the bars of the crib. And,
so one thing you didn't say is, was it alcoholic or not?
I don't know. I mean,
okay.
But I'm assuming it was alcoholic. I don't know. And I mean, that's, again, in the old days, nursing mothers would give their baby, a taste of beer or something,
sure.
Quiet them down.
Sure.
This is the 1950s. So anyway, I like to think, I don't know, but that it would fit the time and the character for that to have been Johnny von Neumann, who was a great party goer and loved children and kind of talked to everybody. He was exactly the kind of guy who would, what's that kid doing alone in that back row? He's unhappy. I'll talk to him. So anyway, that's in the acknowledgments of the book, because somehow that could have been the spark of this whole thread in my life. But von Neumann, the important fact is that we blame von Neumann for this whole digital mess we're in. Like, he supposedly invented the von Neumann architecture that every single computer we use still runs on that same architecture. But he knew it was the wrong path. And if you look at von Neumann's life work, he only ever took out one patent in his life, and his one patent is for a method of non-von Neumann computing. But we forgot about that. So we think of him as the father of digital computing, with Alan Turing, one of the co-founders. But he thought deeply about analog computing, and so when you say non-von Neumann computing, that's not true. It's just like Darwin wasn't really a Darwinist. Von Neumann was didn't believe in his own dogma.
One of the things I remember so strongly about von Neumann was reading in the early 60s an interview with von Neumann in Time magazine, in which von Neumann was to say, we might understand 98% of all of the components that go into a digital computer, but once they start working together, there's 1 or 2% we will never understand, and he actually called that machine consciousness. That was my first experience of somebody who was obviously so important to computers, suggesting that the digital world might give rise to something well beyond the digital world being capable of controlling. And I got a feeling when I read Analogia that you were saying something very similar.
Yes, and even in the strictly digital world, von Neumann was a logician, and so he knew, as Turing knew, and all those people technically know, that even a system that is absolutely deterministic is not necessarily predictable. You can have a deterministic system that is still unpredictable, and he was talking about systems. He said you could do everything you need to do with 10,000 transistors. Of course, now now we're each sitting with 100 billion.
Right.
So it's people. I mean, a huge part of my life was spent going back to the sort of foundations of this stuff when people thought much more clearly. I think people thought more clearly about computing then. And of course, as you know, von Neumann was a consultant for IBM.
Right.
They hired him in 1945. So he sort of mainlined all those mathematical ideas right into that big company. That's what sort of jump-started where we are.
Right. Another thing I can't leave our conversation without saying is how much I loved, and I'm switching around kind of like the way you do in your books. I feel perfectly fine doing that because this is kind of how the book chapters are kind of, switched around. But hopefully those listening to us will sense that there's this thread. I loved the book's layout. And let me tell you why I love the book's layout. As a sailor, as someone who's cruised the Inside Passage, I've done it enough times where I know where I am, by looking at the shape of the mountains on the horizon. And each chapter of this book has a woodcut from the James Cook expedition to the Northwest, which shows you the mountainscape essentially from the water as you might see it. I mean, that is a really cool thing to do with each chapter. It does give you this sense of traveling on the water. But that along with the 32 photographs or 32 pages of photographs that you have in the book, I've written a lot of books and I know how hard it is to get your publisher to actually put in pages of photographs and to do those kind of special graphics. Why was that important to you? It's wonderful. How did you get it done? How did your publisher even agree to that? I think it's great.
Yeah, well, that's thanks to my publisher, Farrar, Straus and Giroux, who agreed to that, and it was a remarkable experience. I mean, I think it was my 5th book, and in every case, the design has always been an enormous disappointment. I mean, people think like the author does everything, and they don't. I mean, you submit stuff, and people seem to believe it's there.
Spoiler alert: we don't do everything in our books.
Yeah, I mean, there's people I think who sort of see their job description as crushing your hopes. I mean, just
right. That's a really good analogy, right?
But in this case, and the remarkable thing was that the book was entirely designed and produced by people working at home. Maybe that's why it turned out so well. Because they weren't in the office where someone could say, "Oh, that looks terrible," But so I had this vision of those engravings, and the designer, Gretchen Achilles, who I don't know, it just anonymously had the job, just did it perfectly. I mean, it came out better than I could have hoped. But I had those engravings for 30 or 40 years, because those are actually technical navigational aids in the days,
okay.
long before GPS and radar. Somehow, again, I was obsessed with them. I collected, the old pilot books would have those drawings, but these were the first ones done on the Cook expedition. So they were sketched. In fact, many of those sketches were done by William Bligh, who was 24 years old at the time. Before
now, is this the same William Bligh
who became Captain Bligh? Yeah, but
that's what I thought.
Then he was a young midshipman who had this gift for drawing sketches, and then they were engraved on copper and printed. And the remarkable thing is, people don't really want them. The journals of Cook were really a bestseller for their time, so they printed lots of copies, and they also printed sort of extra proofs of the illustrations that people could buy on the market. And everybody wants the portraits of the native chiefs or the islands of Polynesia and so on. Those sell for $300 or $400 or $500, but those engravings of the mountains, I think I bought all those engravings that were in the book. I think I bought the whole set for like $80.
That's great.
The originals, printed in 1784.
They're beautiful, and they lend to the sense of adventure and bringing you back to the times that you wrote about. Listen, we're almost through, but I gotta ask you this one question as we're through with our conversation and moving into a question and answer period. From looking at the title to the book, there's a sense that we are moving into an age in which we are no longer in control of the intelligence that we have created in machines, and that's a bad thing. But as I read your book, particularly the last paragraph, it was much more nuanced than just good or bad. There was a sense of inevitability about the coming analog age, but maybe not always the sense that that was a bad thing. So could you say in conclusion a little bit about the trade-offs that we are faced with in this digital moving to analog age?
Yes, and of course, I believe you need to leave things to your reader to decide the ultimate judgment. But no, I think that there's this immediate knee-jerk, Dyson is saying the machines are taking over the world. This is a terrible thing. No, I think exactly, you're saying exactly what's important, that it's we are losing control. but nature is reasserting nature's control. And I fundamentally, I think that's a good thing. I would rather see nature in control than people. And that's the world in which we grew up. I mean, as a species, we've been here for millions and millions of years. Almost our entire upbringing as human beings was spent in a world where we didn't control things. Nature was bigger than we are. And then this sort of illusion came to us with the Industrial Revolution that we can control everything. Of course, von Neumann believed we could control the weather, and we now provably know that that's not so easy. So I think we're moving back into that world which you spent a lot of time studying in your study of myth and so on, where these myths are bigger than we are, and we should accept that, and we're quite good at accepting that. It has a bad side. You see now with the QAnon world and so on, that people want to believe myths that may be bad, but they can also be good. That's up to us to make that choice.
That's great.
So
I think it's a great place to end, George. It's the kind of conversation that I certainly look forward to having more of with you over breakfast when we're able to get back into Old Town Cafe and there is no pandemic.
Yeah, they're serving outside now. It's actually
right. Everybody's praying for that. But thank you again. It's just a great, again, I want to say to everybody listening, this is a book you want to read, not only for George's incredible breadth of intellect and scholarship, but for the information that I think as informed citizens, we ought to have in facing the technology that's in front of us. Thanks again, George.
Thank you, Clyde.
Wow, what a great conversation. And really quickly, I'm going to make myself big again, just because, Clyde, I'm so glad that you mentioned the book and the beautiful engravings, because this is not the ideal way to do this, but I'm hopeful that the audience can see a little bit. Those are the engravings that we're talking about, and they're so cool. And that's at the heading of every chapter. And then also with regards to the pictures that are inside, George, I hope you don't mind, but we do have a young George Dyson circa 1973.
Yep.
I'm going to try to show that without the glare of my lamp, but there's some really great photos in this, and the engravings really do add a lot to it. So what an amazing conversation. I was just sitting here going, my double major French art history brain was just going, whoa. it's a lot, and it's fascinating. So I know that we have a lot of questions, and we have some in our little ask a question box. So I'll go ahead and get to those. We'll get to as many as we can. We've got about 10 minutes or so. Needless to say, these questions are not, what's your favorite color? So we'll get to as many as we can. So at the top of the list, let's see, I don't have the person's name here. So at the end of the book, you said that some will see an empty hat, others the full power of the continuum with its infinities. But what did you mean by not even ashes will remain?
Okay, that's a deep statement. You always, when you write a book, you wonder, how are you going to end the book? So that is a direct quote from a recurring theme in the book, is the ghost dance movement that arose a number of times among the Native American populations across North America. It sort of kept coming back. It had various incarnations, and in the incarnation, sort of the middle incarnation, one of the prophets of that movement explained that the idea was that the white invading civilization, if it was just left alone, it would eventually sort of consume itself and go away. And one of the prophets made this statement, not even ashes will remain. Mm-hmm. And that is my statement about, I think, what is somewhat going to happen to this sort of digital layer we're living in now, that it is going to not disintegrate, but be be superseded by something else. And that's it's extremely risky to make any predictions. So it's sort of done in a prophetic way. So
Okay.
it's not as doom and gloomy as it sounds.
Okay. Good. Okay, so Matt would like to know, since you previously wrote about Alan Turing, who was able to produce astonishing results with limited digital resources, why hasn't today's advanced technology been able to solve problems like, oh, I'm just picking something at random here, a global virus that seems to be causing a few problems these days for humanity?
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, that's again, the amazing thing to me always is how those people in von Neumann's group who did solve all these important problems, because of course one of them was building hydrogen bombs, which was maybe not something we wanted, but they did all that they had only 5 kilobytes of memory. That's like 1/2 second of a MP3 playing on your iPod. So yeah, I think it's baffling how the same way now it's people have all this technology to write books, but are we really writing any better books than in Shakespeare's time? I think provably not. But so it's strange that we haven't advanced more now with COVID. I think the jury is not in on that yet. I think we may look back in 50 years and see this period as similar to World War II and what happened at Los Alamos and these other labs where a huge amount of work is being done behind the scenes by the people, the real day-to-day scientists who are not speaking in public but are working on trying to solve this real biological problem for humanity. And I think the problem is there's just so much hype around the political questions right now, but behind the scenes, I think we are making real progress in a way that will have tremendous implications for sort of life in general, the same way that things that were developed for radar or something suddenly have turned into television and change people's day-to-day lives.
I'm going to suggest another thing, George, if I can just jump in. I'll try to do this really quickly, that speaks directly to the analog and digital world. And that is, we are also right now currently trying to use digital technologies to solve what may be analog problems. And that until we really do advance to the stage where our digital technology is allowing analog technologies to be more present and more part of our scientific solutions, we're going to be in a problem. And let me just give you a really good example of that. Facial recognition. We train facial recognition technologies on billions of images of faces, and yet a child's brain at several months, which has never been trained on billions of faces, does a better job of recognizing human beings than our computers. And when we are able to have a technology that allows emergent analog properties even more than we do now, I think we may get better solutions to some of these analog problems we're dealing with. My 2 cents.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Same with climate.
Yes.
So this is more of a personal nature for the two of you. From Nadia, she says that she knows that you're both boat people, and we did spend a good deal of time in the green room talking about boats. She wants to know what else the two of you think you have in common. Apart from also about being both growing up East Coast, right? Anything else?
Chance to crowdfund your new boat. Here you go.
Right.
We'll start the GoFundMe.
I'll let you answer Nadia's question first, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, well, it's unusual. I mean, I haven't spoken to anyone who has as much in common as I do with Clyde. And the fact that we both, nobody has interviewed me about this book who knows anything about the Northwest Coast in any kind of tangible way. I mean, to them, it's just sort of like the set for something else. And so we have that in common. We have the East Coast upbringing of that. That's if you watch this TV series Mad Men, we come out of that world, right, where people smoked in the office, and everybody in IBM wore a suit. That world. In fact, Clyde, you were like one of the first people to not wear a suit, and got in trouble for it. And we both moved west, and we both have this deep connection with digital computing and Bellingham and the Old Town Cafe and everything else. So our lives are closer in ways that I don't share with almost a handful of other people.
That's a really kind thing to say, George. I certainly feel the same way. And I'm also going to say that one of the other things, Nadia, that I feel connected to George with is George has the kind of mind that I aspire to have. That is this really expansive intellect which can manage in parallel so many different threads of an idea or a conversation at the same time, and yet congeal them into a single point of reference that you just listen to and say, yeah, that really makes sense. So I love that about George. I love that about sitting in conversation with him. And I just, as I said, I aspire to that level of being able to handle thoughts and ideas in a similar way.
Well, and I'm just going to really quickly point out there's all kinds of love in the chat on the right-hand side of the screen, and I'm going to echo Chris's comment that Bellingham is lucky to have both of you here as residents. So you are great conversation partners. I would say that for sure. We have three more now questions in the question box. So I'm just going to, but I don't know how quickly we can go with these. Let's see. What did George Steller really know about scurvy? Was he guessing, or did he have some data or information to guide him? And that's from Aaron.
Yes, that's a good question. So Steller was Leibniz convinced Peter the Great to launch this enormous scientific expedition to America. I mean, they started out with 12 scientists and entire riverboats of scientific equipment. And the list is quite colorful of what they brought, and orders from the Tsar that everybody had to give up. Every town they passed through, the best houses had to be given up for the professors. And so Steller, who was like 26, was the only scientist who actually made it to America. And everybody on the ship hated him. I used the analogy that he was like the observer on a factory trawler. Factory trawlers out there who are raping and pillaging the North Pacific have to legally carry a scientific observer to monitor their catch, and everybody on board hates the poor person. Was the observer, and everybody hated him. But he did know about scurvy. He listened to the natives, but I think he had his own, because he was technically, legally both a Lutheran minister and a botanist. So he knew that green plants would cure scurvy, but nobody listened to him. So big part of the beginning of the book is just this series of people dying horribly of scurvy.
It sounds a little bit to me like Anthony Fauci.
Exactly. Yes, it's exactly the same. They just didn't like him because he was a scientist and he knew more than he did, and he was right, and that pissed him off more than anything else.
Right.
Until finally people realized that actually listening to him was not such a bad thing.
Okay, I know we're almost at the hour, but there's a real meaty question in the question box, and it's about, again, double major humanities. So I don't know what this is. SETI, S-E-T-I. SETI will remain an analog search. Turing said intelligence is essentially various sorts of search. What does that say about our potential civilizations besides ours?
Okay, so SETI is the acronym for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence.
Okay, I understand that. Thank you.
And that's a very good question, because how are we going to recognize intelligence when it's there? Freeman, my dad, was always very explicit that that's absolutely just stop right there. That's the wrong acronym. That you cannot search for intelligence. There's all kinds of, you can imagine all kinds of intelligence that is not discoverable. So what you're actually, the only thing you can search for is big technology, the civilizations that, you know, the I would say people, they're not going to be people, but the people who are all, you know, all on the internet watching YouTube videos produce no detectable signals. It's only the people who are, you know, moving planets around and doing big spectacular things that are detectable. So the first thing we have to recognize is that we're not going to, you know, there was this window when the human species radiated a huge amount of radiation into space, and so that was sort of a bunch of I Love Lucy, you know, programs are out there echoing through the cosmos, and then we went dead quiet. We got the internet and fiber optics and stuff. We're not radiating anything anymore. So it's a very deep question of what are you actually listening for? You can only hope that our civilization's sending signals, maybe not. So the fact that we have not found the signals that we thought we would find if we listened, I don't think means it's not there. And of course, we also, which is part of the book, this question of language, that we assume there has to be, because we're intelligent and we have language, intelligence means you have to have language. That's not necessarily true. And it could be language that's so unlike ours that the recent film Arrival sort of tried to give some sense of that. What, you know, creatures show up who have just an entirely different form of communicating.
Like orcas, as you mentioned.
Yes. I firmly believe orcas are fully intelligent, but for 50 years we've been looking for orca language. We haven't found it. You know, why do they need language?
Well, there are two more little questions that are kind of, I think, based on that question. Linda and David want to know, digital computers are based on, oh, this is getting very technical for me. I'm just going to read it as it says it. Digital computers are based on bits, 0 or 1. Quantum computers are based on qubits, 0 and 1, and everything in between. Does the quantum computer, there's a word missing here, does the quantum computer have a new way of doing analog computing? This may be the question.
Yes, that's an interesting, deep question. The problem with quantum computing is that we're trying to use it to just solve these digital problems, and I don't say anything about quantum computing. I'm sort of, again, it's like string theory. There's so many people working on it that I need to work on it. So quantum computing is you know, it's real and it's developing. It's going to change things. Personally, I don't think it's going to change things as much as I think it's being oversold as changing things more than it actually will. I think kind of day-to-day, hardworking, old-fashioned analog computing is probably going to change things more. Like your future cell phone, your future self-driving car, in just a very few years will have analog chips that do the ground level speech recognition, the ground level watching for kids running across the road and stuff will be done with analog computing, not quantum computing. And it will be a hybrid with digital. But quantum computing is real, but it, you know, it's where it really has impact is encryption and decryption and those big, huge problems. But then von Neumann said the same thing about his computers. Oh, they're just going to be big things that belong to governments. They're never going to belong to normal people. And of course, it's wrong.
Yes, and here we are. Chris wants to know, is it possible to push our current digital approach to dealing with nature to become more analog? Is it something we can pursue intentionally? Yeah,
well, that's what I'm sort of preaching. I mean, I think we're doing it. I think we're in this sort of analog revolution, and nobody talks about it. It's still people think analog is archaic. So I'm trying to be the sort of Samuel Butler who says, hey, you know, look, this thing is coming at us. We should acknowledge it.
Okay, and last question, because it's completely out of left field. So I just want to ask it. Cheryl wants to know what are your favorite books? You can name 2.
Whoa.
of all
You have
time.
to go first on that, George.
And as a bookseller, I will say that that's just usually where my mind goes totally blank.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many favorite books. One of them,
Yeah.
I just took it off the shelf because I was looking at it today, was Insect Societies by Ed Wilson. It's all about ants and termites and stuff. I mean, I just have no end of books. I have a reference book here I still use all the time, just called the Materials Handbook. Any material, I was wondering what we had a train wreck in Canada, and it was a gypsum. So I don't really know what gypsum is. So you look up gypsum, there's a whole page and a half on where we get gypsum, what it's used for. So I just love. I have a book here it's the catalog of the Dewey Decimal System. You can just read it like a novel. It's a tragedy that we're throwing out so many books. So.
Okay, so my two favorites are the British Columbia Pilot Guide, which, and George is holding a thumbs up on that. That is how you navigate safely through the waters of British Columbia. And even though I don't currently have a boat, I read that to remind myself of what it was like to being on the water. So that would be one of my favorites. And then my other one is a book by Joseph Campbell, which is not that well known, although Campbell is, and that's Transformations of Myth Through Time. And I've read that over and over and over again, and I always get something wonderful from that. Thank you.
I love that question. Thank you, Laurel, for that. And there it is, Ocean Passages for the World.
Yeah, that'd be very similar.
That's all with maps. That's all the sailing routes. If you want to go from Jakarta to, Long Island, what's the best route to take?
I love it that Margaret Bickman says, yay for the Dewey Decimal System. And I feel the same way. I love the Dewey Decimal System also. But, wow. Well, I think we actually addressed every single question. And gosh, this has been wonderful. I think that you were just the ideal conversation partners. Thank you, Clyde, for doing that. And for being so, it's wonderful how knowledgeable you were. If I had been the one, for example, conducting the conversation, the questions would probably have been much different. And I appreciate that. So thank you both very much. Thank you to everyone who is in the audience tonight. We love it that you're here. Even though we can't see you, we can feel the love and the interest that's in the room. Gentlemen, do you have anything that you want to say?
Thank you, George. Always loved talking with you.
Thank you, Clyde, and thanks to Village Books.
Yes,
thanks
to Village Books.
Keeping the community together. So.
Yep, and of course, you can click on that little button right in the center of the screen where it says Purchase Analogia here, and you will get signed copies of either Think Black or Analogia, or both. You can certainly buy both of them. We are not going to tell you can't. So,
Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you. So I think that's it. We are signing out. Have a good night.